Alan Wilson Watts was born on January 6, 1915, in the village of Chislehurst, Kent, England. He was the only child of Lawrence Wilson Watts, a representative for the Michelin Tire Company, and Emily Mary Watts, née Buchan, who taught at a boarding school for missionaries' children. Growing up in the English countryside without great wealth, Watts developed an early fascination with nature, learning the names of wildflowers and butterflies, and an interest in spiritual matters, likely influenced by his mother's devout Christian upbringing. From a young age, Watts was captivated by the art and literature of East Asia, which helped spark his lifelong spiritual curiosity. Missionary friends returning from China and Japan gifted the Watts family Oriental tapestries, paintings, and carvings, and these decorated the family's parlor. The boy found himself enchanted by the Chinese and Japanese landscape paintings, admiring their clarity and sense of spacious harmony. He later recalled being aesthetically fascinated by the vision of people's participatory relationship with nature depicted in this art, a theme that would stay with him throughout his life. Watts also described experiencing a mystical dream during a childhood fever, an early glimpse into altered states of consciousness that intrigued him. Such experiences inspired his youthful imagination and set the stage for his spiritual journey. Watts attended the King's School, Canterbury, a prestigious boarding school where he was an excellent student. He won a scholarship to King's and often topped his classes. However, when it came time for university, he failed to secure a scholarship to Trinity College, Oxford. In his application essay, he boldly imitated the style of philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, which did not impress the examiners. Lacking the funds to attend Oxford without a scholarship, Watts instead took up clerical jobs, first at a printing house, then a bank, while pursuing his own education in spare time. During his teen years, he spent much of his free time in London immersing himself in Eastern spirituality. By age 15, in 1930, he had joined the London Buddhist Lodge, a society dedicated to Buddhist thought, and at 16, he was bold enough to declare himself a Buddhist. Watts became secretary of the Buddhist Lodge at 16, and also editor of its journal, The Middle Way. Demonstrating precocious scholarship, Watts published his first booklet, An Outline of Zen Buddhism, in 1932 at the age of 17, introducing Zen concepts to English readers. A few years later, in 1936, he released his first full-length book, The Spirit of Zen, A Way of Life, Work, and Art in the Far East. This early work reflected his youthful understanding of Zen, largely drawn from the writings of renowned Japanese scholar D.T. Suzuki. Watts would later critique The Spirit of Zen as unscholarly, but it marked an important milestone as his debut book. In 1936, Watts had the chance to meet D.T. Suzuki in person at the World Congress of Faiths in London, a formative encounter with the elder Zen teacher whose work had deeply influenced him. By his late teens, Watts's path was clearly set. He was committed to exploring Eastern philosophies and finding ways to interpret them for Western audiences. Watts' worldview was shaped by a rich blend of Eastern spiritual traditions and Western thought. In his formative years, Zen Buddhism was his primary inspiration. He admired Zen as a synthesis of Taoist, Confucian, and Buddhist insights, a tradition where spiritual insight is interwoven with everyday life and art. Zen's emphasis on direct experience and the illusory nature of the ego resonated with Watts, and he often described himself in spirit as a Zenist, even if he never formally became a Zen monk. Taoism also deeply influenced him. He was drawn to the Taoist idea of the watercourse way, living in harmony with the natural flow of the universe, which became the theme of his final book, Tao, the Watercourse Way. Hindu philosophy, particularly Vedanta and yoga, informed his understanding of mystical unity as well, since these teachings had in turn influenced the development of Zen in China and Japan. Watts had a lifelong interest in what he called the perennial philosophy, the core truths common to the world's spiritual traditions, and he sought to illuminate those truths in his work. At the same time, Watts was conversant with Western philosophy, science, and psychology, which he integrated into his spiritual perspective. He had a broad intellectual appetite. He read the works of Western mystics and philosophers, from Nietzsche to William James, and kept up with contemporary ideas like general semantics, cybernetics, and the new physics in the mid-20th century. For example, in his famous book The Way of Zen, he drew analogies between Zen principles and modern cybernetic theory, illustrating how feedback loops in nature could mirror Zen's self-regulating insights. He was also influenced by depth psychology and the works of Carl Jung, even meeting Jung in Switzerland in 1958 during a European tour. Watts believed in triangulating understanding by comparing diverse cultural perspectives. This comparative approach was inspired by his sense that truth can be approached from many angles, and that Eastern wisdom and Western science each shed light on the human condition. He maintained a playful skepticism toward rigid dogmas, East or West, preferring personal experience over blind belief. Crucially, Watts was inspired by direct mystical experience and the beauty of the natural world. Throughout his life, he sought moments of insight, whether through meditation, contemplation of nature, or even the use of psychedelics in controlled settings. In the late 1950s, he began experimenting with psychedelic substances, such as mescaline and LSD, as tools for exploring consciousness. He believed these chemicals, like a microscope or telescope, could provide a temporary glimpse of profound truths, but he cautioned against becoming dependent on them, famously saying, "When you get the message, hang up the phone." This openness to altered states was part of his broader inquiry into the mind. Meanwhile, the patterns of nature themselves fascinated him. In the 1960s, he became passionate about how natural patterns repeat from the microscopic to the cosmic scale. His sensitivity to nature's rhythms fed into his environmental awareness. He was early to warn about the perils of ecological imbalance and human alienation from nature. In sum, Watts drew inspiration from Zen masters, Taoist sages, Hindu Vedantists, Christian mystics, modern scientists, psychologists, and the simple wisdom of nature. This eclectic range of influences enabled him to serve as a bridge between East and West, translating spiritual ideas into familiar terms without losing their depth. After his early success with Buddhist publications in England, Watts took a major step in 1938 when he moved to the United States. That year, he married Eleanor Everett, whose mother, Ruth Fuller Everett, was deeply involved in the Zen community in New York, and the young couple relocated across the Atlantic. Watts had hoped to undertake formal Zen Buddhist training under Soke-an Sasaki, a respected Zen teacher in New York. He did study Zen in New York City for a time, but ultimately found the strict training method unsuited to him and left without receiving ordination as a monk. Seeking a new outlet for his spiritual leanings, Watts decided to channel his interests through Christian ministry. In 1940, he moved to Illinois and enrolled at Seabury Western Theological Seminary in Evanston, near Chicago. Over the next few years, Watts immersed himself in Christian theology, scripture, and church history, all the while attempting to synthesize Christian mysticism with the Asian philosophies he knew. He earned his master's degree in theology in 1945. His thesis explored parallels between Christian mystical experience and Eastern thought, and was later published as the book Behold the Spirit, a study in the necessity of mystical religion. In 1945, Alan Watts was ordained as an Episcopal Anglican priest and began serving as an Episcopal chaplain at Northwestern University in Chicago. At the pulpit, he strove to introduce his congregation to a more mystical, contemplative form of Christianity, one that acknowledged the insights of Buddhism and Vedanta. His unorthodox sermons, however, were not universally appreciated by the church hierarchy. After several years, Watts felt increasingly constrained by the formal church setting and the doctrinal limits of his role. In early 1950, he made the bold decision to leave the Episcopal Church, resigning his ministry. This marked a turning point in his career. From this point on, Watts would pursue a more independent path as a writer, teacher, and speaker outside any formal religious institution. In 1951, shortly after leaving the church, Watts moved to California, which would be his main base for the rest of his life. He accepted an invitation to teach at the newly formed American Academy of Asian Studies in San Francisco, today known as the California Institute of Integral Studies. There, He taught courses on Buddhism and comparative philosophy from 1951 to 1957, and eventually became the Academy's dean and administrator. This academic setting allowed Watts to interact with like-minded scholars and artists. For example, he collaborated with Japanese painter Saburo Hasegawa, who taught him about Zen aesthetics, brush calligraphy, and traditional Japanese arts. Watts also took up studying Chinese language and calligraphy, becoming proficient in classical Chinese so he could read Taoist and Zen texts in the original. These years coincided with the emergence of the so-called Zen boom. In America, a surge of interest in Zen Buddhism among intellectuals and artists, especially in San Francisco and New York. Watts found himself at the forefront of this movement. He gave public evening lectures that attracted Beat Generation poets and writers, and he became known as one of the leading voices making Eastern wisdom accessible to the West. One of Watts' most significant platforms was radio broadcasting. In 1953, he began hosting a weekly program on KPFA, a listener-supported radio station in Berkeley. His first series, The Great Books of Asia, featured him expounding on Eastern classics and was later followed by a series called Way Beyond the West. These talks, delivered in Watts's engaging conversational style, quickly gained a loyal following in the San Francisco Bay Area. By rebroadcast, his lectures soon reached Los Angeles via KPFK and other cities, becoming one of the longest-running public radio programs of its kind. Watts' voice on the airwaves, erudite yet humorous, established him as America's foremost popularizer of Asian philosophy during the 1950s. He was not a traditional academic. He jokingly referred to himself as a philosophical entertainer rather than a professor, yet he held visiting teaching positions. For instance, a fellowship at Harvard University, 1962 to 1964, and a scholar role at San Jose State in 1968. Despite his outsider status in academia, by the late 1950s, Alan Watts had an immense influence on educated Western audiences eager for spiritual alternatives. Watts' writing career flourished in the 1950s and 60s, producing many of his most famous works. He authored more than 25 books on philosophy and religion, noted for their clarity and wit. His breakthrough mainstream success was The Way of Zen, 1957, a comprehensive introduction to Zen Buddhism that became a bestseller. In The Way of Zen, Watts traced the history of Zen and explained its principles for Western readers, even weaving in insights from linguistic theory and science to draw parallels with Zen practice. The book was widely praised and helped cement Zen's place in Western popular culture, effectively laying the groundwork for the explosive interest in Zen meditation that followed. Around this time, Watts also published Nature, Man and Woman, 1958, an exploration of natural ecology and human sexuality through a spiritual lens, and Psychotherapy East and West, 1961, in which he argued that Western psychology could become a path to liberation akin to Eastern traditions if it overcame its rigid dualism. Always ahead of the curve, he delved into the psychedelic counterculture with The Joyous Cosmology, 1962, recounting his experiments with LSD and mescaline and the philosophical insights they afforded. By the mid-1960s, he wrote The Book on the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are, 1966, distilling Advaita Vedanta ideas about the illusory nature of the self for a general audience. During the late 1950s and 1960s, Watts became a highly sought-after public speaker. He toured college campuses and auditoriums across the US and Europe, dazzling audiences with eloquent talks on everything from Zen Buddhism and meditation to social issues, sexuality, and the meaning of life. He even hosted a television series in 1959 to 1960 on public TV station KQED in San Francisco, titled Eastern Wisdom and Modern Life, bringing these ideas into American living rooms. Charismatic and often humorous, Watts had a talent for demystifying esoteric concepts. He could quote a Zen koan or a verse of the Tao Te Ching on stage and then relate it to the everyday anxieties of modern Western life. This made him a guru to the counterculture, even if he never claimed that title himself. As the youth-led cultural revolution of the 1960s unfolded, marked by a surge of interest in meditation, yoga, holistic living, and questioning of materialism, Watts stood out as a clear voice linking spirituality and society. Many young people, especially in California, looked up to him as a guide to living more freely and consciously. The rise of popular practices like vegetarian diets, yoga, and transcendental meditation in the West during the 1960s can be partially traced to Watts' influence in disseminating Eastern ideas. By the end of the 1960s, Alan Watts had become something of a household name in the realm of spirituality. He continued to lecture widely and to publish books and essays. Never one to sit still intellectually, he explored new frontiers of thought, from ecology, warning early on about pollution and waste, to the philosophical implications of technology. In a 1971 television interview pilot called Conversation with Myself, filmed amid the redwoods of Muir Woods, he mused about the frantic pace of modern society and the need for a more holistic consciousness beyond linear thinking. By this time, Watts was splitting his residence between a houseboat in Sausalito and a secluded cabin in the forested community of Druid Heights on Mount Tamalpais in California. Druid Heights, a bohemian enclave founded by poet Elsa Gidlow, was home to artists and counterculture figures. Watts felt at peace in its rustic, communal atmosphere and even dedicated the joyous cosmology to his neighbors there. In his late years, he also worked on Tao, the Watercourse Way, intending it to synthesize his mature philosophy. It would be completed by his collaborator Al Chungliang Huang and published in 1975, 2 years after Watts' death. Alan Watts' personal life was as colorful and unconventional as his public persona. He married 3 times and had 7 children in total. His first marriage was to Eleanor Everett in 1938 when Watts was just 23. The couple had 2 daughters, born in 1938 and 1942, but the marriage fell apart by 1949. Eleanor's mother, Ruth Fuller Everett, had initially connected Watts with the Zen community. And even after the divorce, Watts maintained correspondence with his former mother-in-law, indicating the lasting impact of that early connection. In 1950, Watts married Dorothy DeWitt, with whom he had 5 more children. Dorothy accompanied him to San Francisco when he began teaching there. However, by the early 1960s, their marriage grew strained, coinciding with Watts' increasing fame and his meeting of Mary Jane Yates King, nicknamed Jano, during a lecture tour in New York. Watts separated from Dorothy and, after a divorce, married Mary Jane in 1964. With Mary Jane, he divided his time between the houseboat in Sausalito and the cabin at Druid Heights, embracing a free-spirited lifestyle close to nature. Mary Jane, Jano, remained his partner until the end of his life. Watts' romantic and social life did not always conform to conventional norms. In addition to his marriages, he engaged in extramarital relationships. Most notably, he had a long-running affair with poet Jean Burden in the 1950s. Burden became a significant intellectual companion for Watts. He credited her as an important influence and even dedicated his book, Nature, Man, and Woman, to her, under a cryptic dedication. This openness in his personal relationships was characteristic of Watts' bohemian ethos, but it also caused pain within his family. Later in life, he frankly acknowledged his shortcomings as a husband and father. Watts was a self-described neglectful father at times, given how absorbed he was in his work and travels. He could be charming and gregarious in company, but also restless and occasionally irresponsible in personal matters. In terms of personality, those who knew Watts describe him as charismatic, witty, and rebellious. He had an infectious laugh and a love of humor, often poking fun at religious pretensions, including his own. Rather than presenting himself as a guru or enlightened master, Watts preferred the persona of the philosophical entertainer, a term he proudly used. He enjoyed being an educator and provocateur who challenged people's thinking without claiming any spiritual authority over them. Indeed, in one 1970 lecture when pressed by students about his status, he replied that he was not an academic philosopher, but a performer of philosophy. This lighthearted stance made his teachings approachable. He dressed stylishly, often seen in a suit or a robe depending on context, had a British accented eloquence, and could converse about fine art, cuisine, and literature as easily as he could about Zen koans. His love of aesthetics was notable. He appreciated good architecture, music, and especially the ceremony of life. In his autobiography, he wrote that cultural renewal comes from the mixing of diverse cultures, reflecting his cosmopolitan taste for variety. However, Watts also had a darker side in private. He struggled with habits of heavy drinking and smoking throughout his adult life. Friends and colleagues sometimes grew concerned as his alcohol consumption escalated in the late 1960s. Despite his profound insights into human consciousness, Watts was not immune to depression. Near the end of his life, he experienced bouts of sadness and fatigue. His health began to decline under the strain of years of alcohol use and possibly an undiagnosed heart condition. These personal challenges show a human vulnerability behind the public figure. Yet, in spite of, or perhaps because of, his imperfections, Watts remains a relatable and compelling figure. He was authentic about his flaws, often stressing that spiritual understanding does not equal moral perfection. This honesty about being only human is part of what endeared him to many followers. It is often noted that Watts lived as a bridge between worlds, East and West, spiritual and material, and in doing so, he also had to navigate the tensions within himself. Throughout his life, Alan Watts was driven by an insatiable curiosity and a quest for insight. From the curious child enchanted by Eastern artwork in his parents' parlor to the esteemed speaker addressing thousands, Watts retained a sense of wonder about the universe. One of his earliest inspirations was the mystery of nature. As a boy inspired by Chinese and Japanese paintings, he perceived that humans are not separate from the natural world, but an integral part of it. This understanding, that self and environment co-create each other, became a cornerstone of his philosophy. Watts often said that man and nature rise mutually, mutual arising in his words, and that seeing this clearly is key to spiritual insight. He delighted in gardens, forests, and the sea, frequently using nature analogies in his talks. In California, he took up sailing. The experience of catching the wind in a sail, rather than fighting against it, exemplified for him the Taoist principle of living in flow with reality. Another deep inspiration for Watts was the idea of the eternal now. He was profoundly influenced by teachings that emphasize living fully in the present moment, an idea he encountered in Zen Buddhism and also in Christian mysticism. In his 1951 book, The Wisdom of Insecurity, written after he left formal ministry, Watts argued that true security comes from embracing insecurity, i.e., relinquishing the futile quest to control life and instead finding peace in the present. This was a radical insight that ran against conventional Western striving. He taught that anxiety comes from constantly clutching at the past or future, and that freedom lies in accepting impermanence. Such concepts were inspired by his study of Buddhism, with its focus on impermanence and suffering, and by personal reflection during periods of solitude. Indeed, Watts was known to take retreats, either in nature or simply secluding himself to clear his mind. Those quiet moments provided inspiration that later poured forth in eloquent lectures and writings. Watts was also inspired by dialogue and exchange. He thrived on the cross-pollination of ideas from different cultures. For example, meeting the Zen teacher D.T. Suzuki gave him a living connection to Japanese Zen, while conversing with monks, professors, poets, and even psychologists, all enriched his perspective. He often referred to the concept of upaya, skillful means, the Buddhist idea of using whatever methods help awaken insight, and applied it broadly. This meant he was willing to draw inspiration from anywhere. A classical text, a scientific theory, a joke, or a psychedelic journey could all be grist for the mill if they illuminated some truth about the human experience. His open-mindedness was itself a driving force. He was perpetually learning and synthesizing. Crucially, Watts was inspired by the desire to share enlightenment playfully rather than didactically. He once said that the role he enjoyed most was that of a guide who points things out to people, rather than a guru who must be obeyed. His lectures were often improvised performances where he'd respond to the energy of the audience, using anecdotes and witty metaphors to spark moments of recognition in listeners. What inspired him was often seeing that light bulb go off in someone's mind, when a person suddenly grasped a profound idea or laughed at the cosmic joke of existence. He called this the giggle in the cosmos, the realization that underneath all our striving, the universe is playing hide and seek with itself through us. Watts found endless inspiration in paradox and play. He was fond of paradoxical wisdom, like the only way to get rid of temptation is to yield to it, quoting Oscar Wilde, because it jolted people into seeing things anew. In short, Alan Watts was inspired by insight itself, by the joy of seeing through illusion and helping others see through it too. This mission kept him continuously writing, speaking, and engaging others until his final days. Alan Watts passed away in 1973, but his influence has only grown in the decades since. In October 1973, after returning from a final European lecture tour, Watts retreated to his mountain cabin at Druid Heights in California. On November 16, 1973, he died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 58. He had been under medical care for a heart ailment, and it's believed that alcohol contributed to his early passing. In a final gesture befitting his life's fusion of East and West, Watts's body was cremated by Buddhist monks on a beach near his home shortly after his death. Half of his ashes were buried at his library in Druid Heights, and the other half at the Green Gulch Zen Center in California, symbolizing his abiding link to both scholarship and Zen practice. Watts's wife, Mary Jane, later revealed that one of the secrets of life he'd shared with her was knowing when to stop, suggesting that Watts faced death with awareness and acceptance. Indeed, his son Mark reported evidence that Watts had intuitively prepared for his passing, almost as if it were his final project in the art of living and dying. In the half-century since his death, Alan Watts's legacy has remained remarkably vital. His books have never gone out of print and continue to be discovered by new readers around the world. He helped inspire the spiritual renaissance of the 1960s, and many of those countercultural values, such as meditation, yoga, and a holistic view of life, have since become mainstream in Western society. Watts can be seen as a pioneer who introduced mindfulness and Eastern philosophical concepts long before terms like Zen or mindfulness were commonplace in the West. By translating complex ideas into engaging English prose, he paved the way for later spiritual teachers and authors. Contemporary figures in spirituality and self-help often cite Watts as an influence, and his writings are a staple in many university courses on religion and philosophy. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Watts's posthumous influence is the enduring popularity of his recorded lectures. With the advent of the internet, Watts gained an entire new audience. His talks, which had been taped and archived by his son and by radio stations, found their way to online platforms. Today, one can hear Alan Watts's sonorous voice on YouTube videos, podcasts, and music tracks, introducing yet another generation to his wisdom. In fact, Watts's lectures have been streamed millions of times. Their conversational, timeless quality makes them highly shareable in short clips on social media. Many people encounter Watts for the first time not through a book, but by hearing a snippet of his talk about "What do you desire?" or "The illusion of the self" on a video. He has even made unexpected appearances in pop culture. For example, excerpts of his speeches have been used in advertising. A series of Volvo car commercials featured his narration and sampled in musical albums. His distinctive voice and message show up in films and TV shows as well, such as the Marvel series Loki, which quoted him, and the video game Everything, which included audio of his philosophies. These references underscore how pervasive his ideas have become in culture. The core of Alan Watts's ongoing influence lies in the clarity and relevance of his teachings. He addressed fundamental human concerns: the search for meaning, the fear of uncertainty, the longing for spiritual connection, in a way that remains directly applicable. In an age where anxiety and disconnection are often cited as plagues of modern life, Watts's voice resonates as strongly as ever. His eloquent explanation of Eastern concepts helps people challenge materialistic narratives and reconnect with a sense of wonder. Listeners often report that hearing Watts is like receiving a refreshing jolt of perspective, even decades after his words were first spoken. Despite his personal imperfections, he is remembered as a brilliant communicator and thinker who had a unique gift for bridging worlds. As one commentator noted on the 50th anniversary of his passing, Watts' legacy radiates as a clear thinker and writer. His impact reverberates far beyond his mortal years, leaving us with a rich tapestry of thought and contemplation. Institutions and his family have also carried on his work. The Alan Watts Organization, headed by his son Mark Watts, curates and publishes Watts's audio and video recordings, ensuring they remain accessible. Efforts to compile his correspondence and unpublished works are ongoing, adding to the archive of his knowledge. In academic circles, Watts is increasingly recognized as an important figure in comparative religion and philosophy in the 20th century. And in the broader public sphere, his quotes and ideas circulate with an almost prophetic status. The menu is not the meal. We are the universe experiencing itself. This is it. Such nuggets of Wattsian insight continue to inspire and provoke. In the end, Alan Watts' legacy is that of a cultural transformer. He helped Western society open up to Zen, Tao, and the wisdom of the East, not as exotic curiosities, but as practical truths for living well. He also reminded Eastern traditions of their vitality by interpreting them anew in English. Through his writing and speaking, he connected thousands of people to a sense of spiritual wonder, and many for the first time. That spark he ignited in individuals' minds is his true legacy. As long as people seek answers to the big questions of existence, it's likely they will stumble upon Alan Watts. And when they do, they will find a friendly, insightful voice waiting to greet them and say with a playful smile that the answer was within themselves all along. Thanks for watching and hope you enjoyed. If you want to see more of these types of videos, give us a thumbs up and drop a comment. Perhaps let's delve into the entire 25 books that Alan Watts wrote, one at a time, and explore the very thoughts he put onto paper. What do you guys think? See you next time.